Now that we've had a chance to look at a pretty wide range of subtractive synthesizers in the software realm, I wanted to preview a little bit what it is we're going to be focused on for the next several videos. And it's really being able to hear and see the differences between various subtractive synthesizers. Specifically hearing those differences so that we can figure out what it is that is really sort of speaking to us, or if you're a music producer, what's going to fit in the context of the song that you're producing. Recently, I went onto YouTube and I had a recommended video pop up, and that recommended video was how to make Serum sound more quote unquote analog. And I'm sure there's some really good techniques in there. I'm sure it's a very useful video. But the whole time I'm just reading the title and I'm thinking to myself, well, if I wanted Serum to sound more analog, doesn't that just mean that I want an analog sound? Shouldn't I then just go and use an analog synthesizer, either the hardware or some kind of an emulation like, the Tall or Monarch or the OBXD? I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Anything from the Arturia suite and so forth. Now, I could make Serum sound more analog, which is not really its design when you consider it's a very digital, clean sounding synthesizer. I could sample a single cycle waveform from, let's say, like a Juno synthesizer, and I could take that, bring it into the oscillator slot, get myself a nice, rich analog starting point, use one of the analog modeled filters, maybe go into the effects, run it through a little bit of tube saturation, and sure, now we're going to have something that sounds a little bit more analog coming out of Serum, but then it is more or less like a hybridized sound. It's using a very clean engine for the most part to try to make something that's then a little more dirty and analog. And if that's what I'm going for and that works, great. But fundamentally, if I want an analog sound, I'm probably not going to use that instrument. So these are some of the determinations that you need to start making and hearing, because maybe you like the way that it then sounds through Serum. It's different. It's like analog, but you can still hear that like cleanness and preciseness of digital. That might really work for what you're doing. So it's all about making these decisions and thinking about these things and knowing what instrument to pull from. So very quickly here, I just need to go back and sort of define this idea of the artist versus the producer, because this is really important to picking synthesizers. If you're an artist, if you're someone like Deadmau5, right? Very recognizable, totally a brand. All the music he puts out, it has to be to a certain standard, a certain level. And of course, his sound has evolved a lot and he's used different tools. But from record to record, he's probably using pretty consistent things for the most part. Obviously, with each new record, probably some newer tools are brought into the fold, but that record, for the most part, is going to have a pretty cohesive sound. I was listening to a few of his songs today, and across the board, I'm like, yeah, this is probably coming from mostly the same synth. It's being run through the same sort of plugins on the way out, and there's a consistent sound, all great songs, things I really enjoy, but he's an artist. Right? Like he's labeled as an EDM producer, but he's so recognizable. The two guys at the bottom, and there's also a guy in a suit, somebody who I don't know, probably don't want to know. But the two guys at the bottom, they're the guys who make up the production duo Stargate. Like, are you aware of that? I would guess most of you don't know who those two guys are, and that's because they exist in the shadows. Right? They come in every day and they're given sort of commissions and tasks for certain groups, and they produce that music. So one day they might have to try to do something that's very much like an 80s synth pop sound, and the next day have to do something very, very modern. The day after that, maybe they need to put together some kind of beat. And so for them as producers, when it comes to picking the tools that they're using, they really need to know what everything sounds like so they can plug the right thing in. And I'm not saying that you need to fall on one side or the other, artist or producer, but just be aware that if you go down the producer route, you really need to tune your ears in and know what to plug in for all of these different styles of music that you might be called upon to create. An artist should be able to make really compelling, fantastic music with any of the tools that they're given, as long as they're then consistent with the sound across the board in an EP, in an album, whatever. So I just wanted to stress that before going into the 6 things that we can really sort of highlight and point to that are going to differentiate one subtractive synthesizer from another, since there are so many of them. Beginning with the oscillators, our sound generators. What sort of waveforms are we given? Does the instrument allow us to morph between wave shapes? i.e. wavetables? Is there an FM, AM option, ring modulation, so forth? Anything that's adjusting the sound before getting to the filter stage. So now when we hit the filter, it's like, okay, how does this low pass filter sound different to this low pass filter? How does the LP in massive sound different to the LP in Spire or in Silent or in Serum? How much saturation is built in? What other controls do I have over these filters? Are there comb filters, right? Are there formant filters? What options do I have? Up next, we have modulators, right? So how does this LFO differ from this LFO? Or how do these envelopes differ? Do we have multi-stage envelopes? How does the mod matrix actually work? Is one more user-friendly than another? All the sorts of questions that you have to ask. The next one is kind of the big one and oftentimes the hardest thing to hear, which is the sound engine. So when we put in identical settings, right, like a sawtooth wave going into a basic low pass filter, exact same envelopes, let's say it's like a pluck bass sound, why does this one sound so much different than the other one? And that comes down to sheer coding and the sound engine. It's sort of the color, if you will, of these instruments. And oftentimes that's what has you make that final decision. So if you load up like an Arturia sort of instrument, like one that is using, I think, a lot of samples, like let's say you're using their Mini Moog emulation, how does that sound different to Serum, something that is a little bit cleaner coming out? The next one is effects. What sort of effects is bundled with this instrument? How useful are they? Do you like the sound of them? Does it really color this instrument? Is it an essential part to the instrument? And then the last one isn't really a sound thing, but it's useful for knowing maybe what you want to work with moving forward. How does the user interface flow? Is it confusing to you, or is it straightforward? How user-friendly is the instrument on a whole? And these 6 things we're going to go into more detail in over the next few videos so that we can really kind of hammer home some of these ideas. And again, make that comparison process a lot easier for you, whether you're going to go down the route of being a music producer or being an artist. So I just want to share some of those ideas at this point. I'm not going to keep beating them into the ground as we move forward, but breaking it down like this is the way that you can now start to hear these differences, right? Okay, how is this oscillator different from this oscillator? What features are in this one that aren't in the other? And I think that it's sometimes pretty useful to break it down in text before we get really deep into the examples. And a lot of times I get sidetracked or whatever. So strap in because we're going to start going really deep.